Resident Evil Village has some of the most horrifying enemies in the entire franchise. But the thing is, most people never look past the surface. They see a werewolf, they shoot it, they move on. Today I'm explaining the disturbing lore behind every major enemy in this game, starting with the one that seems the least scary, but reveals something genuinely unsettling about how this village operates. 10. Urias. Here's the thing about Urias that nobody talks about. He's not a lichen. He looks like one. He fights like one. But the game deliberately classifies him as something entirely separate. Urias is a manufactured creature, engineered through bioweapon development programs overseen by the Four Lords and Mother Miranda herself, and that distinction matters more than you'd think. See, the lichens are what happens when Kadu infection runs wild. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and the results vary from person to person. Urias is different. He's the result of controlled, deliberate biological modification. Someone sat down, followed a protocol, and produced this thing on purpose, which is, not ideal, but here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. Urias has a name. Not a human name, a classification name. He occupies a catalog position in a bestiary of created organisms. Think about what that implies. You don't catalog something unless you're making enough of them that you need a filing system. You don't assign specimen designations unless individual creations have become routine enough to require organization. This isn't one mad scientist creating one monster in a basement. This is an industrial scale operation where transforming humans into weapons became so normalized that they needed spreadsheets. The Four Lords had established protocols for this, procedures, presumably paperwork. The horror isn't in what Urias is. It's in the fact that he's entry number whatever in a database full of things just like him. And that's just the baseline. Because if even the least disturbing creature on this list implies a factory line approach to human modification, wait until you hear what they did with the failures. 9. Moroica. There's something uniquely horrible about being stuck halfway through a process. Not finished, not reverted, just frozen in the middle of becoming something else. That's Moroica, a creature that exists in the biological equivalent of a loading screen that will never hit 100%. Here's the thing. Moroica isn't a monster in the traditional sense. It's not a successful transformation. It's not a functional bioweapon. It's what happens when the process breaks down and nobody bothers to clean up the mess. The creature occupies this grotesque middle ground between human and something else entirely, bearing characteristics of both while achieving the full function of neither. It's stuck in a permanent state of becoming, which sounds almost poetic until you realize what that actually means for the thing experiencing it. And that's the part that gets under your skin. For every Urias that came out of those experiments looking like a finished product, there had to be dozens of these. Failed prototypes, incomplete transformations, creatures that didn't meet whatever twisted specifications the Four Lords had in mind. The success rate for this kind of experimentation was clearly abysmal, which means the village was essentially a factory floor littered with biological rejects. But here's where it gets dark. They kept it alive. Whatever Moroica is, whatever half-formed nightmare it's trapped inside, someone made the deliberate decision not to terminate it, not out of mercy, obviously, because mercy would have been a bullet. No, they preserved it, either because they wanted to study what went wrong, or because they simply did not care enough to walk over and end its suffering, which is, not ideal. That means Moroica exists in a perpetual state of modification with no endpoint. No completed transformation waiting at the finish line. No reversal back to whatever it was before. Just an eternity of being wrong, of being incomplete, of being a living error that nobody thought was worth correcting or destroying. But if Moroica represents a single failed experiment preserved in amber, wait until you hear about the lichens, where the failure rate went industrial. 8. Lichens. Here's the thing about lichens that nobody wants to sit with for too long. They weren't born. They weren't bitten under a full moon. They were neighbors, farmers, parents, regular people living in a village who got fed a parasite by the one person they trusted most. Mother Miranda distributed the Kadu parasite across her entire village population. Not as punishment, not as defense, but as raw material for her grand experiment. Every single person infected became an involuntary test subject in a program they never knew existed. One day you're tending crops, the next you're sprouting fur and teeth and the overwhelming desire to tear apart anything that moves. But here's where it gets complicated. The lichens aren't mindless, not even close. They coordinate attacks, flank targets, use weapons, set ambushes. That's not animal instinct. That's tactical thinking. That's a brain remembering how group dynamics work, how to cut off escape routes, how to overwhelm a target through organized pressure. The human minds inside these things didn't vanish. They adapted, and I can prove it. Some lichens retain the ability to speak. Fragmented words, broken sentences, but coherent human language coming out of creatures that look like they should only be capable of snarling, which is, not ideal. Because if some of these things can still talk, still think clearly enough to form words and attempt communication, that raises an extremely uncomfortable question about every other lichen in the game. How many of them were screaming internally? How many retained full awareness of what their body was doing, while the parasite drove them toward violence they couldn't stop? Every coordinated pack attack might represent dozens of trapped human consciousnesses watching themselves hunt, unable to override the compulsion. You killed maybe 100 of these things across a single playthrough. Any one of them could have been a person begging for help in a voice you'd never hear. Cool. Add that to the list of things I didn't need to think about at 2 a.m. But if trapped consciousness inside a monster sounds bad, wait until you see what happens when someone removes the consciousness entirely and just keeps the body. 7. Soldats. Here's the thing about the lichens. As horrible as their transformation is, it happened to people living their lives. They were villagers, farmers, families. The Kadu found them where they existed and twisted them into something else. The soldats are a completely different kind of nightmare because they were made on purpose. Every single soldat you encounter in Resident Evil 8 exists exclusively in laboratory environments and storage facilities, not wandering the village, not hunting in packs, stored, contained, filed away in rooms that look less like dungeons and more like warehouses, because that's exactly what they are. Inventory. The name itself tells you everything you need to know. Soldat is military terminology. Soldier, not a name, not even a species classification, a product designation. Whatever these people were before they ended up on Heisenberg's operating table. Their names, their histories, their entire identities got replaced by a generic military label and a number. They went from being someone to being something, from a person to a line item in a production manifest. And the production line nature of it is what makes this genuinely disturbing rather than just gross. One act of cruelty is a crime. 100 identical acts performed according to documented specifications is a manufacturing process. Heisenberg didn't snap and do something horrible to one person. He developed a protocol, refined it, and then applied it over and over and over again until he had enough units to fill a storage facility. Cool. That's also a thing that happened. But here's where it gets worse. Some of those containment units house soldats that appear biologically alive, despite showing zero behavioral complexity. No movement, no response, no apparent utility whatsoever. They're just sitting there, breathing. Which raises the obvious question, why keep them? If they failed as weapons, why not terminate them? The answer, probably, is that Heisenberg didn't stop experimenting on them just because they stopped being useful. They graduated from product to test subject without ever passing through person again. At least the soldats can't tell you what happened to them. The next entry involves someone who absolutely can, and that makes everything infinitely worse. 6. Ana Beneviento. Every other lord in this game was either forced into transformation or tricked with promises of power. Donna was tricked with something worse. She was tricked with the promise of not being alone anymore. Here's the thing about Donna that makes her section hit different from everything else in Village. The horror isn't body horror. There's no grotesque transformation to point at. No fishman body, no 9-foot vampire frame. The horror is entirely psychological, and it starts long before Mother Miranda ever showed up at her door. Donna Beneviento lost her entire family. The specifics are deliberately vague, but the result is crystal clear. Profound, crushing isolation. A woman left completely alone with nothing but grief and a house full of dolls. And Mother Miranda, being the cosmic scale predator she is, identified this vulnerability with surgical precision. She didn't threaten Donna, she didn't overpower her, she offered her family. Let me explain why that's worse. When you coerce someone through force, there's at least clarity. The victim knows they're a victim. What Miranda did was fundamentally different. She positioned herself as salvation. She appeared to a grieving, isolated woman and essentially said, I can give you connection again. I can make you part of something. And the price was letting Miranda fundamentally alter her body and mind. Can you give informed consent when you've been deliberately made desperate? When the person offering to save you is the same person proposing to change what you are at a biological level? The answer feels like no. And then there's Angie, the doll her father made before he died, which Donna later imbued with biological capability and treats as a genuine relationship. On one hand, this demonstrates remarkable intelligence. On the other hand, clinging to your dead father's last gift so intensely that you animate it into a surrogate companion suggests a psychological break that never healed. She was so alone that she literally brought her childhood doll to life, just to have someone to talk to. The uncomfortable truth is that Donna exists as both victim and perpetrator simultaneously. She was exploited through her loneliness, manipulated into accepting transformation she likely couldn't meaningfully consent to, but she also deploys hallucinations against intruders. She is functionally a monster, just one whose monstrousness grew directly from wounds someone else inflicted. But if you think Donna's recruitment was cruel, wait until you hear what Miranda promised Salvatore Moreau, because that one might actually be sadder for me. 5. Salvatore Moreau. Salvatore Moreau is the only lord in Resident Evil Village who seems to genuinely hate what he's become. And honestly, that makes everything about him so much worse. Here's the thing about Moreau. The guy knows exactly what he looks like. He's fully aware that his body has been twisted into this fish-like, bloated, half-aquatic nightmare, and he hasn't made peace with it, not even a little bit. He copes the way a lot of people in unbearable situations cope. He drinks constantly, actively trying to blur the edges of a consciousness that won't stop reminding him of what he is, which is, you know, not ideal. But before you start feeling too sorry for him, let me explain how he got here. Mother Miranda implanted the Kadu parasite in Moreau, just like she did with all the lords, searching for a vessel compatible enough to resurrect her daughter Eva. Moreau wasn't compatible, not even close. But instead of discarding him, Miranda kept him around, and Salvatore latched onto her with this desperate, childlike devotion. He calls her mother. He craves her approval constantly. He's painfully aware that she doesn't love him, that he's the least favored of her lords, and that knowledge eats him alive. Turns out, no amount of devotion fixes that. What Salvatore got was a body that repulses everyone, including himself, and a position at the bottom of a hierarchy that openly mocks him. Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Donna, they all look down on him. He knows it. He sits in his reservoir, alone, rejected, clinging to the one scrap of belonging Miranda throws his way. The rejection was total. Miranda got what she needed from him, and Salvatore got a lake, a bottle, and a body he can't stand to exist inside. Now here's where the sympathy collapses entirely, because despite being a victim of one of the cruelest deceptions in the entire game, Salvatore didn't just sit in his misery alone, he maintained captive populations within his domain. Living people, subjected to forced transformation, breeding programs, directed personally by Salvatore himself, the guy who knew exactly how horrific unwilling transformation felt because he lived it every single day, turned around and inflicted that exact same nightmare on others. That's the gut punch. Victimhood didn't prevent him from becoming a monster. It gave him the blueprint. His entire trajectory is the perpetuation of trauma made flesh. A man broken by forced transformation, who internalized that suffering so completely that he became the very thing that destroyed him. He didn't just fail to break the cycle, he perfected it. But if you think Moreau's story is disturbing, wait until you hear about 3 women who never even got the chance to say no. 4. The Dimitrescu daughters. Here's a question nobody asks about Cassandra, Daniela, and Bela. When they dissolve into a swarm of insects, do they die? Because that's what's actually happening. These 3 can metamorphose their entire physical body into a collective of parasitic organisms. Not partially, not aesthetically. They literally disintegrate into hundreds of individual bugs, fly around as a distributed cloud of parasites, and then reform into a humanoid shape. And everyone just kind of accepts this as a cool vampire power without stopping to think about what that actually means for the person inside. Here's where it gets complicated. If a unified consciousness persists across the swarm, that means your awareness is simultaneously spread across hundreds of separate organisms with no central nervous system connecting them. You're experiencing existence as a fragmented collective. Your sense of self is distributed across creatures that could, theoretically, fly in different directions. That's not a superpower. That's a nightmare. But the alternative is worse. If consciousness does not persist in swarm form, then every single transformation is death. Full stop. The person dissolves, ceases to exist as a coherent mind, and then reforms with memories intact but no actual continuity of experience. They die and are reborn every time they transform, repeatedly, possibly dozens of times per day, and they'd never even know it was happening, which is, not ideal. But the disturbing lore doesn't stop at the metamorphosis. There's the family structure itself. The daughters exhibit extreme emotional distress when threatened with separation from Lady Dimitrescu. They physically cannot tolerate cold air, which destroys their swarm cohesion. Their entire existence depends on remaining within specific environmental parameters inside the castle. That's not a family dynamic. That's biological containment. Whether these three are actual biological daughters who were subjected to forced parasitic integration, or artificially created entities engineered to fill the role of children, the result is identical. The family bond isn't built on love or genetics. It's built on parasitic dependence. They literally cannot leave. Their bodies won't let them. Every moment of apparent affection exists within a framework where separation means death. Mom, can I go outside? No, sweetie. You'll disintegrate into 1,000 bugs and die forever. The conditioning runs so deep that it's impossible to distinguish genuine emotion from engineered biological response. And that might be the most disturbing part. Not that the family is fake, but that you genuinely cannot tell whether it's real or manufactured. The parasites made the question unanswerable. But if you think the daughters have it bad, wait until you hear about the woman who made them this way. 3. Lady Dimitrescu. Every other lord in this game has an excuse. Moreau was desperate, manipulated by a mother figure who exploited his loneliness. Donna was isolated, traumatized, psychologically broken down until she accepted transformation as salvation. Heisenberg was coerced and spent his entire tenure actively plotting rebellion against Mother Miranda. They were all victims first, and monsters second. Alcina Dimitrescu was not a victim. Here's the thing about Lady Dimitrescu that makes her fundamentally different from every other lord in the game. She came to the table with power already. She was nobility. She had wealth, status, and influence before Mother Miranda ever approached her. She didn't accept transformation out of desperation or manipulation. She negotiated it from a position of strength. She wanted this, and she got exactly what she asked for. And what did she do with it? She built a harvesting operation. The castle doesn't just contain victims. It integrates them into its functioning hierarchy. Human beings are collected, bled, and processed as part of a sustained system that Alcina maintains with what can only be described as enthusiasm. This isn't someone being forced to commit atrocities under duress. This is someone who designed the supply chain, who staffed the operation, who clearly, demonstrably enjoys the process of predation, with full cognitive awareness of what she's doing. But here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The daughters. Alcina's role as mother figure to 3 parasitized individuals raises a question the game never fully answers. Does she actually believe she's their mother? Or does she know exactly what she did to them and simply performs the role of loving parent while fully aware that she subjected them to forced parasitic transformation and repackaged it as family? Either answer is horrifying. If she genuinely believes it, she's delusional on a scale that makes her unpredictable. If she doesn't, she's consciously perpetrating one of the cruelest deceptions in the entire game, dressing up biological violation as love. And the fundamental question underneath all of this, the one that actually keeps people up at night, is whether the transformation made her cruel, or whether it simply removed the constraints that kept pre-existing cruelty contained. Because if the monster was always there, just waiting for permission to emerge, then Alcina Dimitrescu isn't a tragedy. She's a confirmation that some people just need an opportunity. The internet's obsession with her is, honestly, kind of proving the point. 9 feet tall, attractive, commands a castle. Nobody wants to talk about the blood drains in the basement, which is, not ideal. But if you think a willing predator is disturbing, wait until you meet the thing in Donna Beneviento's basement that doesn't even have the decency to look like a monster. 2. The baby. There's a moment in Donna Beneviento's section of the game where every player puts their controller down and says the same thing. What am I looking at right now? And then, about 3 seconds later, wait, is that a baby? It is. Or at least, it was. The entity you encounter is explicitly categorized as an infant, not a creature that vaguely resembles one. Not a monster with baby-like features slapped on for creep factor. An actual infant, maintaining infantile behavioral patterns. infantile cognitive responses, infantile emotional attachment, all housed inside something that has been physically accelerated to enormous size. The body grew, the mind didn't. Here's where it gets genuinely difficult to talk about. If this thing represents what the game implies it represents, a naturally conceived human baby subjected to deliberate accelerated development and parasitic transformation, then we're looking at potentially the single worst atrocity committed in the entire game. And this is a game where people get turned into fish monsters and dissolved into insect swarms. But those victims were adults. They had lives, identities, agency that was stolen. This is something that never even got the chance to develop those things. The violation targets the most fundamentally helpless category of human being possible. And the worst part isn't the body horror, it's the feelings. The creature demonstrates genuine emotional attachment to Donna Beneviento. It shows distress when she's threatened. It reaches for comfort. These aren't programmed combat behaviors or parasitic hunting instincts. These are the responses of something that can feel. Something that experiences fear and love and confusion. Something that is psychologically an infant, regardless of what its body looks like, which creates a complete breakdown of every normal moral response you'd have to an enemy in a video game. Your survival instinct says, this thing will kill me. Your moral framework says, this is a baby that someone did this to, and it's scared. Both of those things are simultaneously completely true. It is utterly helpless in psychological terms and extraordinarily dangerous in physical terms. There is no correct way to feel about it. I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes the horror isn't in the jump scare. Sometimes it's in realizing that something enormous and monstrous is crying because it wants its mother. But if the baby represents someone's experiment gone right, wait until you hear about the woman who designed the entire system. The one who made all of this possible on purpose. 1. Mother Miranda. Every single thing we've talked about in this video, every atrocity, every transformation, every violation of body and mind traces back to one woman. And I'm using the word woman loosely, because here's the thing about Mother Miranda that nobody wants to sit with for too long. She stopped being human over a century ago. Not in any way we understand the word. The conventional reading of Miranda is straightforward enough. Grieving mother discovers the megamycete, a massive fungal superorganism, becomes obsessed with resurrecting her dead daughter Eva, builds a cult, creates the Four Lords, terrorizes a village. Bad lady does bad things. Simple. But the deeper you dig into her lore, the more disturbing that reading becomes. Consider what we actually know. Miranda has existed since around 1919, when she first made contact with the megamycete after Eva's death during the Spanish flu. She demonstrates capabilities that far exceed anything the Kadu parasite grants her subordinates. She can shapeshift into virtually anyone. She can manipulate entire communities across generations. She operates across a century-long timescale with terrifying patience. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Her consciousness isn't purely her own anymore. It's entangled with the megamycete, a fungal network that stores the consciousness of every person it's ever consumed. A hive mind wearing a human face. The implication buried in the game's late-stage revelations is that Mother Miranda isn't simply a grieving mother anymore. She's a woman so deeply fused with an ancient fungal intelligence that the boundary between her will and its influence has dissolved entirely. She carries over 100 years of accumulated knowledge, methodology, and cold calculation. But the thing informing her decisions draws from something far older and far less human than she is. If you sit with that, everything changes. The Four Lords aren't just the victims of one cruel woman's experiments. They're the latest subjects in a research program that has been running for over a century, each one selected with surgical precision. Vulnerable people systematically identified, their specific weaknesses cataloged and weaponized. Donna's loneliness and mental illness, Salvatore's deformity and desperate need for approval, the daughter's youth and dependency. Miranda didn't stumble onto these vulnerabilities. She selected for them, deliberately, across decades of practice. And the philosophical horror underneath all of it is the worst part. If Miranda's consciousness is entangled with the megamycete, if that fungal network absorbs and stores every mind it touches, then what does that say about everyone she infected? Every Kadu host, every lord, every lichen, every creature we've discussed today, they all carry pieces of that same mold inside them, which means none of them are entirely their own anymore. Their thoughts, their impulses, their very sense of self threaded through with something ancient and collective. Not ever again. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.